Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. We're exploring the epic tale of humanity's greatest carbohydrate achievement, bread.
Yes, bread.
That thing you probably have sitting in your kitchen right now, slowly going stale while you order takeout instead. So before we get started, hit that like button if you're ready to learn how your ancestors turned inedible grass seeds into the foundation of civilization. And subscribe if you want more stories about how humans accidentally invented everything important while desperately trying not to starve. Let me know in the comments what your relationship with bread is like. Are you a sourdough starter parent? Do you panic, buy Wonder Bread? Are you one of those people who thinks carbs are the enemy? It's always interesting to see who's here and what brings you to a 20,000 word journey about flour and fermentation. Now settle in. Grab whatever passes for bread in your house, even if it's just crackers, and let's explore how humanity went from chasing mammoths across frozen wastelands to arguing about whether artisan bread is worth $12 a loaf. Because spoiler alert, our ancestors would absolutely murder you for that $12 loaf, and they'd probably be right to do it. So you think bread is simple, just flour and water, right? Oh, you sweet summer child. You're about to discover that bread is actually a 30,000-year saga of human desperation, accidental genius, and the kind of obsessive perfectionism that would make your most neurotic friend look chill by comparison. Picture this: you're hungry. Not modern hungry, where you whine because your DoorDash is 20 minutes late. We're talking ancient hungry. The kind of hungry where your stomach has started eating itself and your brain is basically a screaming void demanding carbohydrates. You're a hunter-gatherer, which sounds romantic until you realize it means you spend 16 hours a day looking for food and the other 8 hours dreaming about it. So there you are, 30,000 years ago, probably wearing something that used to be an animal, when you stumble across these weird little seeds scattered on the ground. Wild wheat, tiny, stubborn, harder than your mother-in-law's heart, and about as appetizing as chewing on tree bark. But you're desperate. So you pop a few in your mouth and immediately regret every life choice that led to this moment. These seeds are basically nature's way of saying, congratulations, you've found food that actively fights back. They're encased in husks tougher than a $2 steak, and even if you manage to crack them open, they taste like disappointment mixed with dirt. But here's the thing about being perpetually on the verge of starvation. It makes you creative in ways that would terrify modern food critics. Someone, somewhere, probably while contemplating whether rocks might be more nutritious, had a brilliant idea. What if we didn't eat these seeds raw? What if we did something to them first? This was the beginning of the end for humanity's simple relationship with food. We were about to complicate everything, and we were going to love every minute of it. The first breakthrough came when some enterprising cave person discovered that if you bash these seeds between two rocks long enough, they turn into powder. Not appetizing powder, mind you. This wasn't the fluffy, white flour your grandmother uses for cookies. This was gritty, brown, full of bits that would make your teeth file a formal complaint. But it was progress, which in Stone Age terms meant it was only slightly more difficult to digest than actual stones. Now you had flour, technically speaking. Flour that looked like it had been through a blender with some gravel, but flour nonetheless. The logical next step was to mix it with water, because water makes everything better, right? Wrong. What you got was paste. Horrible, grainy paste that had the texture of wet cement and roughly the same nutritional appeal. But desperation breeds innovation, and some genius decided to cook this paste. Picture the scene: a family gathered around their fire, probably arguing about whose turn it is to hunt mammoth, when someone slaps this gooey mess onto a hot rock. The sizzling sound it made probably sent everyone running, thinking they'd angered the fire gods. But when the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, something miraculous had happened. The paste had transformed. It was still ugly, still tough, still tasted like regret with a hint of smoke, but it was different. It was bread, the world's first bread, and it was terrible. Absolutely, spectacularly terrible. But it was bread, and more importantly, it was food that didn't try to run away or fight back or poison you with pretty colors. This moment, this accidental creation of humanity's first loaf, was bigger than the invention of the wheel. The wheel just helped you move things around. Bread helped you not die, and unlike hunting, which required skill, courage, and the willingness to chase angry animals across dangerous terrain, bread could be made by anyone with enough patience to bash seeds into submission. Word spread, as word tends to do when you've discovered something that prevents starvation. Soon, everyone wanted to know the secret of turning inedible seeds into slightly less inedible paste cakes. The recipe was simple: find seeds, violence, water, fire. Pray to whatever gods handle carbohydrates. Success rates varied wildly, and early bread making probably resulted in more burned settlements than successful meals. But humans are nothing if not persistent, especially when food security is involved. Over generations, the process improved. Someone figured out that soaking the wheat first made it easier to grind. Someone else discovered that letting the ground mixture sit for a while before cooking created interesting results, though they probably didn't understand they were witnessing the earliest fermentation. The real game changer came when agriculture arrived, which was humanity's way of saying, you know what? Chasing our food around is exhausting. What if our food just stayed in one place? This revolutionary concept required giving up the nomadic lifestyle, which meant no more following herds across continents or discovering new lands every few months. Instead, you got to stare at the same patch of dirt for the rest of your life, watching grass grow. Literally. The transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer wasn't exactly smooth. Imagine trying to convince a group of people who'd spent their entire existence on the move that they should suddenly stop, pick a random spot, and trust that plants would grow there. It was like asking a marathon runner to become a houseplant. But the promise of reliable bread was compelling enough to make people try. Early farming was less Old MacDonald and more Old MacDonald's nightmare. These weren't the plump, cooperative wheat varieties we know today. Ancient wheat was basically still wild, which meant it had attitude. The kernels didn't want to separate from their husks, the stalks were tough as wire, and the whole plant seemed designed by someone who really didn't want humans to eat it. Harvesting involved tools that would make modern farmers weep. No combines, no tractors, not even decent sickles. Just sharp rocks tied to sticks, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Farmers would spend weeks bent over their fields, cutting grain by grain, probably developing back problems that would plague them for the rest of their significantly shortened lives. But the reward was worth it, because agriculture meant surplus. For the first time in human history, you could have more food than you needed for today. You could plan ahead, which was a completely foreign concept to people who'd spent millennia living meal to meal. This surplus changed everything, because it meant some people could do things other than hunt for food. Enter the world's first professional bakers, though they probably weren't called bakers yet. They were more likely called the person who doesn't burn the grain, paste as often as everyone else. These early specialists discovered that bread making was part science, part art, and part luck. They learned that different types of grain produced different results, that water quality mattered, that timing was everything. They also discovered that bread was social. Unlike hunting, which was typically a solitary or small group activity, bread making brought people together. Someone had to grow the grain, someone had to harvest it, someone had to grind it, someone had to bake it. Suddenly, you needed cooperation on a scale that humanity had never attempted before. This cooperation led to settlements, which led to villages, which led to the first awkward neighborhood, disputes over whose turn it was to maintain the communal grinding stones. The politics of bread distribution became incredibly complex very quickly. Who got the best loaves? Who got stuck with the burned ones? How do you divide bread fairly when people contribute different amounts of labor? These weren't theoretical questions. They were life and death decisions that shaped the earliest human societies. The person who controlled the grain supply had power. The person who controlled the ovens had influence. The person who could consistently produce edible bread became indispensable, which was probably the first time in history that being good at cooking was a survival skill rather than just a nice bonus. As civilizations developed, so did bread. The Egyptians, who apparently had nothing better to do than perfect everything they touched, revolutionized bread, making in ways that would make modern bakers genuflect in respect. They figured out fermentation, not through scientific understanding, but through careful observation and probably a lot of happy accidents. Picture an Egyptian baker discovering leavened bread for the first time. They probably left some dough sitting around longer than intended, maybe got distracted by pyramid construction or cat worship, and came back to find their dough had puffed up like it was possessed by bread spirits. The smart move would have been to throw it away and start over. Instead, some brave soul decided to bake the mysterious inflated dough and discovered that it created bread that was light, airy, and infinitely more pleasant to eat than the dense, jaw-breaking loaves they'd been producing. This was bigger than discovering fire. This was discovering how to make fire work for you in ways that created actual pleasure, not just survival. Leavened bread was humanity's first luxury food item, and like all luxury items, it immediately created social stratification. The rich got fluffy bread, the poor got dense bread, and everyone understood exactly where they stood in society based on the texture of their daily carbohydrates. The Egyptians didn't stop there, because apparently they were overachievers. They developed different types of bread for different occasions. Bread for religious ceremonies, bread for daily consumption, bread for the afterlife. They took bread so seriously that they included it in burial chambers, presumably so the deceased could continue enjoying carbohydrates in whatever came next. They also figured out that different grains produced different flavors and textures. Barley bread was dark and dense, wheat bread was lighter and more refined. They experimented with adding other ingredients: honey for sweetness, milk for richness, various seeds and fruits for variety. Suddenly, bread wasn't just sustenance, it was cuisine. The Egyptians' bread obsession spread throughout the ancient world, carried by traders, conquerors, and anyone who'd ever tasted a properly leavened loaf. The Greeks embraced bread with their characteristic intensity, creating multiple words for different types and establishing bread as a cornerstone of civilization. To the Greeks, a society that couldn't produce good bread wasn't really a society at all. Greek bakers became respected artisans, and their bakeries became social centers. People didn't just buy bread, they gathered to discuss politics, philosophy, and whatever passed for celebrity gossip in ancient Athens. The bakery was part grocery store, part community center, part news hub. If you wanted to know what was happening in your city, you went to the baker. The Greeks also contributed something crucial to bread history: standardization. They established weights and measures, quality controls, and regulations governing bread production. This wasn't just bureaucratic efficiency, it was a recognition that bread was too important to leave to chance. A city needed reliable bread the way it needed reliable water or reliable defense. Greek bread varieties multiplied like philosophical schools. There was bread for athletes, bread for soldiers, bread for scholars, bread for religious festivals. Each type had specific ingredients, preparation methods, and social contexts. You couldn't just eat any bread anywhere, you had to eat the right bread for your station, your activity, and your spiritual state. This complexity created the world's first professional bread critics. People whose entire job was to evaluate bread quality, texture, flavor, and appropriateness for various social situations. These weren't casual food reviewers, they were serious scholars of carbohydrates whose opinions could make or break a baker's reputation. The Romans, never content to let anyone else have the final word on anything, took Greek bread innovations and improved them with characteristic Roman efficiency and excess. Roman bakeries were industrial operations that would impress modern manufacturers. They had multiple ovens, specialized workers for each step of the process, and distribution systems that could supply fresh bread to hundreds of thousands of people daily. Roman bread wasn't just food, it was political policy. The phrase, bread and circuses, didn't emerge by accident. Roman leaders understood that keeping the population fed and entertained was the key to maintaining power. Free bread distribution became a cornerstone of Roman social policy, which meant that bread quality and availability were matters of state security. The Romans standardized everything: loaf sizes, grain quality, baking times, distribution schedules. They created the world's first food safety regulations, establishing penalties for bakers who produced substandard bread or who tried to cheat by adding cheaper ingredients. These weren't minor fines. They were serious punishments that could include exile or worse. Roman military campaigns were planned around bread's supply lines. Armies couldn't march without reliable access to grain. And Roman engineering prowess was often devoted to ensuring that bread could reach troops wherever they were fighting. Roman roads weren't built for tourism. They were built for logistics, and a significant portion of that logistics involved moving grain and bread. The fall of Rome didn't end bread's importance, but it did decentralize bread production in ways that would define the medieval period. Without Roman organizational systems, bread making returned to local control, which meant quality and availability varied dramatically from place to place. Medieval bread reflected medieval society, hierarchical, traditional, and deeply suspicious of innovation. The type of bread you ate announced your social status as clearly as your clothes or your house. White bread was for the wealthy, dark bread was for everyone else, and the darkest, coarsest bread was for people who were barely considered people at all. Medieval bakers operated under strict guild regulations that controlled everything from apprenticeship requirements to acceptable profit margins. These guilds weren't just trade organizations, they were powerful political entities that could influence local governance and economic policy. A city's baking guild could essentially hold the entire population hostage by threatening to stop bread production. The guild system created incredibly skilled artisans, but it also stifled innovation. Baking techniques that had worked for centuries couldn't be changed without guild approval, which was rarely given. This conservatism meant that medieval bread remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of years, while other technologies advanced rapidly. Medieval bread was also deeply intertwined with religious practice. Christian symbolism made bread central to spiritual life, and the Catholic Church's influence on daily existence meant that bread production was subject to religious as well as secular regulations. Certain types of bread could only be made for specific holy days, and the Church maintained strict controls over who could bake communion bread. The medieval period also saw the development of windmills and water mills, which revolutionized grain processing. These machines could grind grain faster and more consistently than human-powered mills, which meant better flour and more efficient bread production. However, mill ownership became another source of feudal control, as lords could force peasants to use specific mills and charge whatever fees they chose. Medieval towns were organized around their bakeries in ways that seem strange to modern sensibilities. Baking was typically centralized in communal ovens, partly for efficiency and partly for fire safety. Individual homes didn't have ovens capable of baking bread, so families would prepare their dough at home and then bring it to the town baker for actual baking. This system created complex social relationships and dependencies that affected every aspect of daily life. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in bread innovation, though changes came slowly due to entrenched guild power. Italian bakers began experimenting with new techniques and ingredients, creating bread varieties that prioritized flavor and texture over pure sustenance. This was revolutionary, thinking bread could be pleasant to eat, not just filling. Renaissance bread reflected Renaissance values: creativity, artistry, and individual expression. Bakers began signing their loaves, developing distinctive styles, and competing for reputation rather than just survival. Bread became a form of artistic expression, with elaborate shapes, decorative scoring, and innovative flavor combinations. The printing press revolutionized bread making by allowing the spread of written recipes and techniques. For the first time in history, baking knowledge could be preserved and transmitted without relying on oral tradition or personal apprenticeship. This democratization of information began to break down guild monopolies and regional variations in bread quality. Trade expansion during this period introduced new ingredients and techniques from around the world. European bakers gained access to different types of grain, new spices, and alternative preparation methods. Sugar became more available, leading to the development of sweet breads that blurred the line between bread and pastry. The age of exploration was partly driven by the search for spices to improve bread flavor. The spice trade wasn't just about seasoning meat. It was about making daily bread more interesting and palatable. Nations fought wars over access to spices that would make their citizens' bread taste better, which sounds ridiculous until you consider how much bread people ate daily. Colonial expansion spread European bread, making techniques around the world, but it also introduced European colonists to indigenous grain varieties and preparation methods. Native American cornbread, for example, taught European settlers new ways to create filling, nutritious bread from unfamiliar ingredients. These cultural exchanges enrich bread, making traditions in ways that pure European techniques never could have achieved. The Industrial Revolution transformed bread production more dramatically than any previous historical period. Steam-powered mills could process grain faster and more consistently than any previous technology. Factory ovens could bake hundreds of loaves simultaneously. Transportation improvements meant that fresh bread could reach populations far from grain-growing regions. But industrialization also created new problems. Mass production prioritized quantity and consistency over flavor and craftsmanship. Industrial bread was reliable and affordable, but it often lacked the character and nutritional value of traditional artisan loaves. The trade, off between convenience and quality, became a defining feature of modern bread production. Factory working conditions in early industrial bakeries were horrific even by the standards of the time. Bakers worked 16-hour shifts in sweltering conditions, surrounded by dangerous machinery and toxic fumes from primitive ovens. Industrial bread production was built on human suffering in ways that consumers rarely considered when they enjoyed their affordable daily loaves. The development of commercial yeast was a game changer that made consistent leavening possible for the first time in history. Before commercial yeast, bakers relied on wild fermentation or sourdough starters that required constant maintenance and produced unpredictable results. Commercial yeast eliminated much of the guesswork and skill traditionally required for bread making, but it also eliminated many of the complex flavors that came from natural fermentation processes. 19th century bread reflected 19th century values: efficiency, standardization, and progress. White bread became the ideal, symbolizing cleanliness, refinement, and modern technology. The whiter the bread, the more advanced the society. This preference had unfortunate nutritional consequences, as the refining process that created white flour also removed most of the grain's vitamins and minerals. The rise of commercial bakeries destroyed most small-scale artisan operations. Independent bakers couldn't compete with factories that could produce bread at a fraction of the cost. This consolidation created more affordable bread, but it also eliminated generations of accumulated skill and knowledge about traditional bread making techniques. Urban growth during the Industrial Revolution made fresh bread distribution a major logistical challenge. Cities needed thousands of loaves daily, and they needed them fresh. This demand drove innovations in transportation, preservation, and packaging that would eventually reshape the entire food industry. The 20th century brought scientific understanding to bread, making processes that had previously been based on intuition and tradition. Food chemistry explained why certain techniques worked, which allowed for more precise control over bread quality and characteristics. This scientific approach made bread production more reliable, but it also made it more mechanical and less intuitive. World War I demonstrated bread's strategic importance in ways that shocked military planners. Armies couldn't fight without reliable bread supplies, and civilian populations couldn't maintain morale without adequate bread rations. Governments implemented unprecedented controls over grain production, distribution, and pricing. Bread became a weapon of war, used to sustain allies and starve enemies. The war years also spurred innovations in bread preservation and transportation. Military requirements drove development of longer, lasting bread varieties and more efficient packaging methods. These wartime innovations later transformed civilian bread markets, making it possible to ship fresh bread over long distances and store it for extended periods. Post-war economic growth created new expectations for bread convenience and variety. Consumers wanted bread that was affordable, consistently available, and required minimal preparation time. This demand drove further industrialization and the development of preservatives, stabilizers, and other additives that extended shelf life but often compromised flavor and nutritional value. The Great Depression forced renewed focus on bread as basic sustenance rather than culinary pleasure. Families stretched their food budgets by eating more bread and fewer expensive proteins. Bakeries developed cheaper bread varieties that prioritized calories per dollar over taste or texture. These economic pressures shaped bread preferences that persisted long after economic conditions improved. World War II brought even more dramatic changes to bread production and consumption. Rationing systems controlled access to white flour, forcing many people to eat darker, more nutritious breads for the first time in decades. Governments promoted these darker breads as patriotic choices, though most people saw them as unwelcome reminders of wartime deprivation. The war years also accelerated technological development in ways that would reshape post-war bread production. Advances in chemistry, engineering, and logistics created new possibilities for mass production, distribution, and preservation. These innovations made bread cheaper and more widely available, but they also accelerated the decline of traditional artisan baking skills. Post-war prosperity created the modern supermarket bread aisle, where dozens of varieties competed for consumer attention. This abundance was unprecedented in human history, bread in every conceivable shape, size, flavor, and texture, all available year-round at affordable prices. The challenge was no longer getting enough bread, it was choosing among almost unlimited options. The rise of suburban shopping and car culture transformed bread distribution patterns. Corner bakeries couldn't compete with supermarkets that offered convenience, variety, and competitive pricing. This shift eliminated many neighborhood baking traditions and reduced bread from a daily social interaction to a weekly grocery purchase. Commercial bread production became increasingly automated during the post-war decades. Machines could mix dough, shape loaves, control fermentation, and manage baking with minimal human intervention. This automation made bread cheaper and more consistent, but it also eliminated most of the human skill and intuition that had defined bread making for millennia. The 1960s brought the first serious challenges to industrial bread dominance in decades. Countercultural movements questioned whether progress always meant improvement, and bread became a symbol of this broader cultural critique. Natural food advocates argued that industrial bread was nutritionally inferior to traditional artisan loaves, and they were largely correct. Health food movements during this period rediscovered whole grain breads and traditional fermentation methods. These weren't new techniques, but they were new to generations of consumers who had grown up eating only white industrial bread. The health food movement reintroduced complexity and variety to bread markets that had been dominated by standardized products. The rise of specialty food stores during the 1970s and 1980s created new markets for artisan breads. Consumers began demanding bread that offered more than basic sustenance, bread with character, flavor, and connection to traditional craftsmanship. This demand supported a new generation of artisan bakers who combined traditional techniques with modern understanding of food science. French bread techniques gained popularity during this period, partly due to increased international travel and partly due to growing appreciation for culinary craftsmanship. French baking traditions emphasized technique, timing, and quality ingredients in ways that industrial production couldn't match. American bakers began studying French methods and adapting them for local markets. The artisan bread movement wasn't just about food, it was about values. Artisan bread represented authenticity, craftsmanship, and connection to traditional culture in ways that mass-produced bread couldn't offer. Consumers were willing to pay premium prices for bread that reflected these values, creating sustainable markets for small-scale producers. Sourdough experienced a renaissance during the 1980s and 1990s as bakers and consumers rediscovered the complex flavors that came from natural fermentation. Sourdough wasn't just a bread type, it was a philosophy that prioritized patience, skill, and natural processes over speed and convenience. Maintaining a sourdough starter became a form of culinary meditation for home bakers. The globalization of food culture during the late 20th century introduced American consumers to bread traditions from around the world. Italian focaccia, German pumpernickel, Indian naan, Mexican tortillas, and dozens of other bread varieties became available in American markets. This diversity enriched bread culture, but also created confusion about what constituted real bread. Technological advances continued to reshape bread production, but now these advances often focused on quality rather than just efficiency. Computerized ovens could control temperature and humidity with unprecedented precision. New mixing techniques could develop gluten structure more effectively. Understanding of fermentation chemistry allowed bakers to manipulate flavor development with scientific precision. The rise of no-knead bread techniques in the early 2000s democratized artisan bread, making in revolutionary ways. Home bakers could produce bakery quality loaves with minimal time investment and no special equipment. This accessibility sparked renewed interest in home baking and challenged the assumption that good bread required professional training and expensive equipment. Social media transformed bread culture by creating communities of home bakers who could share techniques, troubleshoot problems, and celebrate successes. Instagram and YouTube made it possible for anyone to learn advanced bread making techniques from expert bakers around the world. This knowledge democratization accelerated innovation and skill development in ways that traditional apprenticeship systems never could have achieved. The gluten-free movement of the 2000s and 2010s created entirely new categories of bread products designed for people with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. Developing gluten-free breads that approached the texture and flavor of traditional wheat breads required completely rethinking bread chemistry and production methods. This challenge drove innovations that benefited all bread consumers. Ancient grain varieties experienced renewed popularity as consumers sought more diverse and nutritious bread options. Spelt, emmer, einkorn, and other heritage wheats offered different flavors and nutritional profiles than modern wheat varieties. This trend represented both a return to historical practices and a reaction against industrial agriculture's emphasis on high-yield monocultures. Fermentation science advanced dramatically during the early 21st century, revealing the complex microbiology that makes bread possible. Understanding the relationships between different types of bacteria, wild yeasts, and fermentation environments allowed bakers to manipulate bread characteristics with unprecedented precision. This knowledge made it possible to recreate historical bread varieties and develop entirely new ones. The COVID-19 pandemic triggered an unexpected bread renaissance as lockdowns forced millions of people to cook more meals at home. Flour shortages became common as home bakers rediscovered the satisfaction of making their own bread. Social media filled with images of sourdough starters and homemade loaves as people found comfort and creativity in this ancient craft. Pandemic baking represented more than just a hobby. It was a return to food self-sufficiency that connected people with fundamental human skills their grandparents might have taken for granted. The simple act of mixing flour, water, salt, and yeast became a form of meditation, creativity, and resistance against the uncertainties of modern life. The resurgence of interest in fermentation during this period wasn't limited to bread. People discovered that the same principles that made sourdough possible could create kimchi, kombucha, and dozens of other fermented foods. This broader fermentation awareness created more sophisticated understanding of the microbiology that makes bread possible. Modern artisan bakers combine traditional techniques with contemporary understanding in ways that create breads superior to anything available in previous eras. They understand gluten development, fermentation chemistry, and heat transfer in ways that allow them to manipulate every aspect of bread character. This knowledge, combined with access to high-quality ingredients from around the world, makes possible bread varieties that would have astonished bakers from any previous century. The current bread landscape offers more variety, quality, and accessibility than any previous period in human history. Industrial breads provide affordable, consistent nutrition for billions of people. Artisan breads offer craftsmanship and flavor for consumers who prioritize quality over convenience. Home baking provides creative outlet and food security for people who want direct control over their bread. Bread technology continues advancing in ways that address contemporary concerns about sustainability, nutrition, and accessibility. New milling techniques preserve more nutrients while creating desirable textures. Fermentation research reveals ways to improve digestibility and create new flavors. Sustainable agriculture practices ensure that future generations will have access to diverse, high-quality grains. The future of bread will likely emphasize personalization, sustainability, and health in ways that build on but transcend current trends. Advances in food science will create breads tailored to individual nutritional needs and dietary preferences. Sustainable agriculture will preserve grain diversity while reducing environmental impact. Automation will make artisan quality bread more widely available while preserving traditional craftsmanship skills. But regardless of technological advances, bread will remain fundamentally what it has always been: the product of human ingenuity, necessity, and desire for sustenance that nourishes both body and soul. From those first accidental loaves created by desperate hunter-gatherers to the sophisticated artisan breads available today, bread represents humanity's ongoing relationship with the natural world and our endless capacity to transform basic ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. Every loaf of bread contains the entire history of human civilization, agriculture, trade, technology, art, politics, religion, and social organization. When you bite into a piece of bread, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the very beginning of human culture. You're connecting with countless generations of bakers, farmers, millers, and bread eaters who understood that bread is never just bread. It's survival, creativity, community, comfort, and hope, all wrapped up in a simple combination of grain, water, salt, and time. And despite all our technological advances and changing dietary preferences, that fundamental truth remains unchanged. Bread is, and will always be, one of humanity's greatest achievements: the transformation of grass seeds into civilization itself. The story of bread is ultimately the story of us, told through flour dust and fermentation bubbles, through burned loaves and perfect crusts, through famine and abundance. Every culture that has ever existed has had its own relationship with bread, its own techniques, its own traditions, its own way of turning grain into sustenance and sustenance into culture. Consider the Japanese, who took rice and created a bread culture entirely separate from wheat-based traditions. Their approach to grain-based sustenance developed along completely different lines, yet served the same fundamental human needs. Rice cakes, steamed buns, and countless other grain-based foods filled the same cultural and nutritional roles that wheat bread filled in other parts of the world. Or look at the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who developed corn-based bread traditions thousands of years before Europeans arrived with their wheat obsessions. Tortillas, cornbread, and dozens of other corn-based breads created thriving civilizations that understood the same basic principles as their wheat-growing counterparts. Grain plus processing plus heat equals survival. The diversity of bread traditions around the world reveals something profound about human nature. Given the same basic challenge, how to make grass seeds edible, different cultures developed radically different solutions. Yet all of these solutions shared common elements. They required community cooperation, they created social rituals, they became symbols of cultural identity, and they provided the caloric foundation that made complex civilizations possible. African bread traditions developed unique techniques for processing indigenous grains like teff, sorghum, and millet. These grains presented different challenges than wheat, requiring different processing methods and creating different textures and flavors. Ethiopian injera, made from teff, creates a sourdough flatbread with a spongy texture that serves as both plate and utensil. This isn't just different from European bread traditions. It represents an entirely different philosophy of how bread should function in daily life. Indian bread culture developed an incredible diversity of techniques and varieties, from the unleavened chapatis that could be cooked on simple griddles to the more complex naans that required tandoor ovens. Indian bakers understood that different grains, different cooking methods, and different fermentation techniques could create breads suited to different climates, different occasions, and different social contexts. The spread of bread knowledge around the world wasn't just about recipes, it was about adapting universal principles to local conditions. Bakers in tropical climates had to develop techniques that worked in high heat and humidity. Bakers in cold climates had to figure out how to maintain fermentation when temperatures dropped. Bakers in arid regions had to conserve water while still producing edible bread. These adaptations required the same kind of ingenuity and persistence that characterized the original development of bread making. Each environment presented unique challenges that demanded creative solutions. The result was an incredible diversity of bread traditions that reflected both universal human needs and specific local conditions. Modern global food culture has created unprecedented opportunities to experience this diversity. You can eat Ethiopian injera, Indian naan, Mexican tortillas, French baguettes, and German pumpernickel all in the same city, sometimes on the same day. This accessibility would have been unimaginable to previous generations, who typically knew only their local bread traditions. But this globalization has also created new challenges. Traditional bread making skills are disappearing as industrial production becomes more dominant. Young people in many cultures are losing connection with the bread making traditions that sustained their ancestors. The convenience of buying bread, rather than making it as costs that extend beyond simple economics. The loss of traditional bread making skills represents more than just culinary decline. It's a form of cultural amnesia. When people no longer know how to make their traditional breads, they lose connection with agricultural cycles, seasonal variations, and the fundamental processes that connect human communities with the natural world. Yet there's also reason for optimism. The artisan bread movement, the rise of home baking, and growing interest in food traditions suggest that people still value the skills, knowledge, and connections that bread making represents. Social media and global communication make it easier than ever to preserve and share traditional techniques, while also fostering innovation and experimentation. The current moment in bread history is unique, because we have access to more knowledge, more techniques, and more ingredients than any previous generation. A home baker today can learn sourdough techniques from San Francisco, study ancient grain varieties from the Middle East, experiment with fermentation methods from Asia, and source ingredients from around the world. This unprecedented access creates new possibilities, but also new responsibilities. With so much bread knowledge available, we have opportunities to create breads that surpass anything available in previous eras. But we also have the responsibility to preserve traditional techniques and understand the cultural contexts that gave them meaning. The environmental implications of modern bread production are becoming increasingly important as climate change and resource scarcity create new constraints on agriculture. Industrial wheat production requires significant water, energy, and land resources, while also contributing to soil depletion and chemical pollution. Sustainable bread production will require rethinking everything from grain varieties to distribution systems. Ancient grain varieties often require less water and fewer chemical inputs than modern wheat, while also providing superior nutrition and more complex flavors. Reviving these varieties could address environmental concerns while also improving bread quality. But transitioning to more sustainable grain production will require changes in agricultural policy, consumer preferences, and economic systems. Local grain production is experiencing renewed interest as communities recognize the vulnerability of global food supply chains. Regional grain growing and local milling can reduce transportation costs, support local economies, and create more resilient food systems. But rebuilding local grain infrastructure after decades of consolidation requires significant investment and community commitment. The future of bread will likely involve balancing efficiency with sustainability, convenience with quality, global access with local production. These aren't simple trade-offs, they're complex challenges that will require innovative solutions and careful consideration of competing priorities. Technological advances will continue reshaping bread production in ways we can't fully predict. Precision fermentation could create new types of yeast and bacteria that improve bread flavor, nutrition, or shelf life. Automated systems could make artisan, quality bread more widely available while reducing production costs. New understanding of grain genetics could create varieties that are more nutritious, more sustainable, or better adapted to changing climate conditions. But technology alone won't determine bread's future. Cultural values, economic systems, and social priorities will shape how we use new technological capabilities. The choices we make about bread production and consumption reflect broader decisions about what kind of society we want to create and what kinds of relationships we want to maintain with food, community, and the natural world. The story of bread is far from over. Every day, millions of bakers around the world are continuing the ancient process of transforming grain into sustenance, carrying forward traditions that stretch back to humanity's earliest settlements while also innovating and adapting to contemporary needs and possibilities. Whether they're industrial bakers producing thousands of loaves for supermarket distribution, artisan bakers crafting small batches for local communities, or home bakers making weekly loaves for their families, they're all participating in the same fundamental human activity that has sustained our species for millennia. Each loaf they create carries forward the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of bakers, while also reflecting the unique circumstances of our current moment. The bread we eat today is both ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, local and global. It connects us with our deepest history, while also pointing toward possible futures. And that's perhaps the most remarkable thing about bread, its ability to remain fundamentally unchanged while constantly adapting to new circumstances. The basic process, grain, water, fermentation, heat, has remained constant for thousands of years. But the infinite variations possible within that simple framework continue to create new possibilities, new flavors, new traditions, and new connections between people and communities. So the next time you eat a piece of bread, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most important traditions. You're connecting with countless generations of people who understood that bread is never just bread. It's community, culture, survival, creativity, and hope, all baked together into something greater than the sum of its simple ingredients. The transformation of wild grass seeds into the stuff of life represents one of our species' greatest achievements. And every time we continue that tradition, whether by baking, buying, or simply eating bread, we're keeping alive the flame of human ingenuity that has sustained us through every challenge we've faced and will sustain us through whatever challenges lie ahead.